Welcome to the Age of Fission radio show with your host, Lonnie Clark. We stand together and accept that we now live in a world transformed by Fukushima. From 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time here on UCY.TV radio. We relentlessly engage every ear that listens. We expose and confront the complete lack of accountability for the nuclear industry. Consider social engineering programs who view our bodies, minds, and souls as assets on a balance sheet. We discuss vital current issues, interview activists, and engage our audience in an effort to allow all voices to be heard. The Age of Fission radio show creates a venue that all will choose. We encourage our listeners to reclaim their power and their courage to take action and save our planet from the ravages of greed and indifference. Our actions matter. Every voice matters. We remind our listeners that happiness is resistance. Love is greater than fear.
Good morning, UCY.TV radio listeners. This is Lonnie Clark with the Age of Fission radio show. Thank you for joining us, and I really want to thank IPPNW for airing our show also. It's pretty awesome of them to carry our show. We are listened to in Eugene, Oregon on Monday night at 6, on Tuesday night at 10 o'clock, and on Thursday night at 10 o'clock. So we appreciate that, carrying our broadcast. Today we have with us Mr. Chuck Johnson, who's a friend of our show. He used to work for Oregon Physicians for Social Responsibility, and now he has a relatively new job, been there since the beginning of the year. He is now working for the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, IPPNW, and he is the Director of Nuclear Programs. So thank you, Chuck, for joining us. We really appreciate it.
That's great to be on, of course.
It's awesome to have you
show.
back.
I love the freewheeling style in which you run
it. That's kind of my lifestyle, free will. You know, I'm self-employed, so I pretty much cut my own hours. So that sort of flowed into my radio show. I'm not very rigid. I actually like people to have the interview that they want to have. Like, I don't like got you questions. I want you to communicate, because the work you're doing is vital. Like, one of the reasons that I really appreciate this show and being able to interview people is because when I first paid attention to Fukushima, I didn't think anybody was out there, because the media suppresses all these organizations and your beautiful work. We just don't, it doesn't pop up on the radar. And I could not find anyone paying attention to Fukushima except for some, pretty ill-informed and self-important people. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And so doing the radio show, when I came onto the radio show, I actually got it just by accident, as a matter of fact. And I decided, by that time, I had been in it for 3 years and knew of many organizations. And I was determined to have people on who were actively engaged in really addressing it and changing what we have to live with. So I really appreciate you changing your career path to make this a goal of your life. So really, thank you, Chuck. I really have to say I appreciate it.
It's been getting back on my actual desired career path. So it's been really wonderful for me being able to work for PSR on nuclear power issues, and now working for IPPNW on nuclear weapons issues. I just feel very at home. I feel very fortunate to be able to do that.
Why don't you tell our listeners what you've been working on since you've been out there? You've been in Boston, and you've been working for IPPNW as the nuclear programs director. What are you, what's your current task?
Our main focus has been for a while promoting a new treaty the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons that the United Nations passed last summer on July 7th by a vote of 122 to 1 to 1, no and 1 abstention. And then with a number of countries boycotting it, including all the nuclear weapons states and many of their allies. But it basically, what this treaty does is treat nuclear weapons like any other pariah weapon, like chemical weapons or like biological weapons, which have been banned by international treaty, or like cluster munitions, which has also fairly recently been banned, or landmines, which has been banned by international treaty. Why not nuclear weapons? The IPPNW's Malaysian and Australian affiliates were frustrated with the lack of progress among the nuclear weapon states in going to zero, which they are required to do under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and yet they're just not. They've gotten stuck at still a very high number of nuclear weapons in the case of the United States and Russia, and still a number of the other states have retained their weapons. In fact, in the history of nuclear weapons development, only one country has developed them and then gotten rid of them, and that was South Africa, which developed them under apartheid. And then when they moved from an apartheid to a democratic system, they got rid of their nuclear weapons. I think the white rulers were concerned about a black majority country having nuclear weapons or something like that. So it wasn't all just out of the goodness and kindness of their beings, but in any case, that's the only example of a country doing that. And so under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the 5 declared nuclear weapons states agreed to negotiate down to zero, and in return, the rest of the countries that signed it agreed to forswear developing nuclear weapons. But the progress wasn't there. So 11
what year
years
was
ago,
that? What year was
that? That was in 2007 that Ron, so funny, I'm just blanking on his name now, the head of the Malaysian IPPNW, who was also a co-president of IPPNW, said, why don't we treat this like the landmine treaty? Why don't we advocate for a separate treaty? And the Australian IPPNW affiliate said, good idea, let's form an organization. And so they formed ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. Found some other like-minded activists in Australia to start it, and then broadened out. They didn't want it to just be a doctors group. They realized early on that it needed to have other organizations involved. So there are now 10 groups that are in the international steering group that makes decisions and hires and fires staff, which is now based in Geneva, which is one of the places where the United Nations meets, and then there's another almost 500 partner organizations worldwide at this point that have joined ICAN. And this movement grew steadily over time with the help from certain key countries, Mexico, Norway, until their government changed. They went from a labor government to a conservative government, and their policy flipped. But prior to that, they were extremely supportive and funded a lot of ICAN. We were getting government funding from the government of Norway. And Austria was a really key country that hosted a lot of the conferences. The basis for arguing for it was the humanitarian consequences of nuclear war, which is something that IPPNW and Physicians for Social Responsibility have been talking about since their beginning. Is the only cure to nuclear war is prevention. The consequences are so horrendous: the destruction of medical infrastructure, and then also on top of that, this possibility of if enough weapons are set off, of creating nuclear winter, which was first hypothesized in the 1980s famously by Dr. Carl Sagan and others. that we could block out enough of the sun's rays to cause crops to fail and people to starve to death.
How many weapons do you think that would take? I mean, that sounds like
the estimate.
A lot.
The most recent estimate was done by Alan Robach, who is a physicist and computer modeler from Rutgers University. He and his colleagues did an estimate of what an exchange between Pakistan and India, which are both now nuclear weapon states, of 100 nuclear warheads of Hiroshima size. If they attacked one another, not even with their entire arsenals, but just with 100 nuclear weapons, there would be several million that would die in those attacks, and tens of millions. But then there would be up to 2 billion people who would be in danger of starving to death just from the fact that major food crops would be harmed for decades after an attack like that, and it'd be especially acute the first 2 or 3 years after that attack. You would have whole crops that would fail, and people would start starving all around the world. So this fact was something that most people didn't know still, and Austria helped to host conferences in which diplomats were educated to this fact. We were there. The International Committee for the Red Cross, Red Crescent, was really crucial to the passage of this treaty, because they have such enormous credibility, and they were backing us and this, completely. As were other international medical associations that we worked with. We appealed to the World Medical Association, which represents national medical associations worldwide, including the AMA in the United States. Worked with us and endorsed us, as did the World Federation of Public Health Associations and the World Nursing Associations. So we had all these medical groups saying, this is clearly an illegal weapon. This is a weapon that if you use it, you are attacking non-combatants and killing them. So, why do we not want to ban this weapon? There's a real simple answer to that. Unfortunately, the nuclear weapons states have gotten accustomed to using that threat to get what they want militarily. And so that's a really difficult thing to overcome internationally. But enough countries became convinced over time, as we built more of a campaign, as we branched out into a number of different sectors of society. Another really key group was Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which is a group that has been around for a really long time. But they had a project called Reaching Critical Will that really did a lot to activate people in different parts of the world to get involved in this. Faith community, there's a group called PAX that's, its basis is Catholicism, but it's also, I think, more ecumenical now. But, so a number of different coalitions and groups came together. Strategists who had been involved in various anti-nuclear weapons activity saw this as a really good avenue and got involved and joined in. So we had, and a lot of young people too. So we had a really good mix of young and old that were activated and involved in this. And it culminated in the treaty passing, despite the protests of the United States and the other nuclear weapon states, but especially the U.S. Ambassador Nikki Haley organized a press conference outside of the meeting room where the treaty was being discussed. And it was a very strange spectacle, because it's not common to have the United States doing what we would normally do, which is be on the outside protesting a meeting happening inside, that we're not part of. That sounds more like something we would do than something the United States would do. But they organized this outside press conference with, I think, somewhat reluctantly, Great Britain and France. They sort of realized that they looked stupid when they did it. it didn't really affect anything, but it made the U.S. look weak and look like it was losing on this treaty, which it was, because unless you're an ally of the United States or one of the other nuclear weapon states, this doesn't seem like having nuclear weapons in the world doesn't seem like such a great deal, especially if it puts the entire world at risk. If unstable characters such as our current U.S. president, might either accidentally or intentionally start a war that could affect everyone. That is true. It's an exciting time to be involved.
He has no idea the gravity of his decisions. I doubt he would understand what he would be doing. We've talked amongst ourselves about whether it's worth trying to get to Trump and explain some of this stuff to him, because when Reagan was president, his first term, he was making tons of threats. It was in many ways kind of similar to the way Trump has behaved as president, in terms of kind of throwing his nuclear weight around in this case, with the Soviet Union at the time, and talking about surviving a nuclear war. And eventually, the nuclear freeze movement got so strong that the Republicans decided they had to listen to that. And then you had Mikhail Gorbachev on the Soviet side proposing that we amp the rhetoric down and start making deals and to reduce nuclear weapons. So in that atmosphere, Dr. Helen Caldicott, one of the people who revived Physicians for Social Responsibility in the 70s. It's basically had sort of ceased to exist as an organization, and she was in the Boston area, and along with a couple of other young doctors, revived PSR. And she got a chance to meet with the president, with President Reagan, and explain to him about nuclear winter and about not surviving nuclear war, and it seemed to have an impact on him. And it had an impact on Nancy Reagan. So, the thought is, could we have that kind of an impact on Trump if we were at the opportunity? And I'm not sure. The guy changes his mind, every 5 minutes. And he seems to be more narcissistic than probably any president we've had that I'm aware of. Malignant narcissist. That's the downside. There's a lot of narcissists you can tolerate. They're all probably narcissists to make it into the White House.
Yeah.
He's malignant. And the thing is, having him understand and comprehend would just give him further weaponry. Like, he's a dangerous human being. It would make him comprehend it's kind of like, I think, why he's gotten out of hand lately, because he's beginning to comprehend the power that he has as president of the United States. When he first went into that office, he did not understand the power that he has, and you can tell the difference in his face now. He knows he has a huge wall of insulation around him because he is the president. So that's what makes this whole idea about nuclear weapons and him super.
Well, right now
he's on edge.
The thing that the South Koreans have successfully done, which most countries have figured out, that the way to get Trump to do things that you want him to do is to, praise him personally, over the top personally. And he just absolutely loves that, or do things with enormous pomp and circumstance, as was done in both France and China. And he feels like he's got really great relationships with the leaders of France and China because they treated him so well when he visited. So the South Koreans, we're observing this. They're in the crosshairs. If the United States and North Korea have a war, they all die. Probably, depending on how far that war goes. So they don't want that to happen, and their government seems to be pretty skilled and well motivated, and so they're giving Trump credit for all of the negotiations that are happening. They're saying it was his tough leadership that brought us there, and also, echoing the idea that maybe he deserves, if all this works out, maybe he deserves the Nobel Peace Prize.
That's an insane thing. You know who would deserve it is the president of South Korea. He's the one who did it.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, if you can say that scaring the daylights out of your allies to the point where they're willing to speak to their dire enemies because they're afraid of what you're going to do to their enemies who could instigate war on themselves is deserving of a peace prize. I mean, that's a long stretch in my view.
Of course it is. And but at the same time, that really does illustrate what it takes to kind of keep him satisfied is to feed his ego, and so we'll see what happens. He's got people in his administration. John Bolton is the absolute worst person he could have ever picked for national security advisor. The guy
not if you're intent on having war. Not if you're planning a war. If you plan on
he wants to have war with Iran.
The greatest president in the United States to clean up the mess that everybody left behind, and that's going to require, hate to say it, folks, war. Sorry, that's his attitude.
Right. Well, he goes back and forth. That's the thing. He wants to get credit as the great peacemaker in South Korea, and now he's going to break the treaty with Iran, and basically set them up so that they'll do what South Korea did. They'll say, the United States can't be trusted. We can't sign treaties with them. We can't trust them. We have to get nuclear weapons to keep these guys from attacking us. Unfortunately, deterrence won't even necessarily work in the case of North Korea because the United States is so insane. They're talking about having a so-called limited bloody nose strike of North Korea and hoping that North Korea wouldn't then move on to nuclear weapons. But that's a pretty dangerous game to be playing.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that the game they're playing now is let's make peace and let's make Trump the hero for bringing peace to the Korean Peninsula. I'm not ready to. I jokingly, our executive director Beatrice Finn said that if he signs an agreement to denuclearize the U.S. and Russia, that she'd be happy to put in a good word for him. And I'm not sure we're quite ready to go there, but he has a ways to go to demonstrate his Nobel Prize worthiness.
Yeah,
but at the same time, I do understand South Korea saying things like that because that's, until he's out of office, we're just going to have to try and
placate him,
keep him at bay. Yeah, placate him.
I mean, that's really it. We need to calm the monster down. He's like a spoiled, rotten brat who has all the power in the world. It is kind of a shock, but. Back to the work that you're currently working on, because this is pretty important. What are you doing in your daily life? Like, what is your activities? Your responsibility is pretty heavy because you have a pretty lofty goal.
Well, after the treaty passed last year, and this is when I was still working for Oregon PSR, and my predecessor, John Loretz, had my job, and he gets the credit for being one of the people who helped orchestrate all of this. But I came on in January, and at that point, our task is getting 50 countries to officially sign the treaty, and then to have whatever process they go through in their country to ratify it. Some people, it's like all one action. There is a process by which you sign and ratify simultaneously. Most countries have a representative body that has to ratify a treaty. Yeah. And at this point, we have 8 countries that have signed and ratified and 58 that have just signed. So if all the ones that have signed also ratify, then we will get to 50, and we're hoping to get all of the original 122 and then some to sign and ratify ultimately. But our immediate goal is 50 by 1,000 days after the passage of the treaty at the UN.
So are you involved connecting with the liaisons from these nations and discussing the work that you have to do, or what? Is that like you reach out? Which countries do you think are the biggest focus? Like, isn't this kind of like a domino theory? If you can get the X country to do it, Y and Z will also sign. You know what I mean?
Some of that, yeah. That's definitely part of the strategy. There's a guy named Tim Wright who's with ICANN. He's one of the first. I think he was the first ICANN employee actually in Australia, and he's stuck with it all this time. And he's still a young man. I think he started when he was 24, so I think he's only 35 at this point. But he is in charge of keeping track of all of the efforts worldwide in different countries to get signatures and ratification. And we've broken it down by regions, and we have different people working in different regions. And our responsibility is to work with our affiliates. We have 63 affiliates worldwide, some of which are in some of these target states. We're targeting the ones who are easier. We're not targeting the nuclear weapon states or their loyalist allies. We are targeting a few on the margins who, like Sweden, for example, which is not in NATO but has military ties to NATO. And they voted for the treaty.
They did?
They did.
They're one of the largest weapons they're one of the largest weapons dealers on the planet, Sweden.
They're a very paradoxical country. It's a very interesting country, yeah. So the politics in Sweden are quite complex right now, and our Swedish IPPNW affiliate is right in the thick of trying to influence they have to do a study on what the impact would be for signing and ratifying the treaty. And so that's going to guide what their parliament does. And so right now in that country, our affiliate is involved in trying to influence that in a way that leads toward signing and ratifying. And there are others fighting the other direction, including inside the government. So it's kind of a power struggle within the ruling party and the government over that issue.
Well, what's the argument against?
To see what happens.
What do you come against?
The argument against is pretty simple. It's that, hey, after the initial attacks in Japan to end World War II, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we haven't had nuclear weapons used. And deterrence works, my friends. Until we have a world in which people trust one another, having responsible countries with nuclear weapons, it's sort of like good guys with guns, are the answer to,
that's
gun violence.
That's exactly what I honestly, that's exactly what my professor at the University of Oregon said in our international relations class, that nuclear weapons keeps us safe. That's the thinking among political scientists. I'm like,
right.
What?
Among some. It's certainly not unanimous. And many have indicated how close we've come to making mistakes and started them, or intentionally started nuclear wars. The Cuban Missile Crisis, if Kennedy had been a different person, we would have had a nuclear war with the Soviet Union.
Chuck, I think we already have a nuclear war. We already have it.
True.
Look at Hanford. Look at the WIP. Look at Fukushima. Look at Chernobyl. Look at 3 Mile Island. They are all poisoning our own people. The weapons have hit in our own land. We've done it to ourselves. So this business of, the difference is with a nuclear weapon, you see the deaths all at once, and it's right in your face. And the people on the other side of the planet have to look at it.
Well, and it's even more disastrous than the harm that the industry does intrinsically. But that's a really important point, and it's actually in the treaty. There's reparations for people who have been harmed by the nuclear age that were written into the treaty as an important part of the treaty. So once it goes into force, for example, let's say the Marshall Islands decides that they want, additional compensation for the things that happened to them as a result of nuclear weapons testing, they can use that treaty as a basis for getting that. And uranium. If the United States ever joins the treaty, which hopefully they will, probably one of the last countries, then it would also mean that it would need to help people who've been harmed by uranium mining and other aspects of of nuclear development, nuclear weapons development. The treaty is weird in one way, though, from my standpoint personally. As an organization, IPPNW does not have anti-nuclear power position. And obviously, that's been an important part of my career. And many of the IPPNW affiliates do fight nuclear energy. The German affiliate is really strong in fighting nuclear energy, and some others are. But there are other affiliates that are more closely associated with their governments, which favor nuclear energy. Particularly the Russian affiliate can't take an anti-nuclear power position. They don't feel they can. And some others are in that position. The Japanese affiliate is in that position as well, which is, again, kind of strange, but it's true. Right. So because we can agree on nuclear weapons, we do that. And then we're just sort of silent on nuclear power. We're not pro-nuclear power. But this treaty that we're promoting is pro-nuclear power.
It's true. Article 4 of the treaty. That's what in there. There's a little handout on the IPPNW website, and a few pages in it says there's a little part of it like what's in the treaty, and part of it says the good parts, and then the downside. It does actually say the problems inherent in the treaty. So it's calling out, it's letting you know that this is not the end-all, be-all perfect deal. Because it says Article 4, the treaty outlines inalienable right of all parties to research, produce, and use nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. So you still have the peaceful atom clause.
Right, and that's a real problem in the end game of nuclear weapons. Even if you thought nuclear power was good, which I don't, and it isn't. But you can, when you operate a nuclear reactor, particularly a large power reactor, you generate a lot of radioactive waste that has plutonium in it that can be extracted and used in nuclear weapons. So it's really hard to get down to zero weapons material if you're continuing to run a nuclear power cycle, fuel cycle. You can also, in enriching the uranium for traditional nuclear power plants, this is what the Iranians were doing that the United States got so freaked out about, was that they were enriching their own uranium instead of buying enriched uranium from Russia or somebody else. And they were saying, what do you mean? This is within our rights. This is the peaceful use of the atom. Well,
that's
if you
keep
enriching that uranium,
and actually,
you can
this treaty,
make nuclear weapons with it, so that's what the United States didn't want them to do.
Yeah, but this is the really insane part of Trump wanting to walk out of this current Iran treaty. The way this current treaty is, the inspectors can show up anytime unannounced, and they have, and it viewed that they are in compliance. So this is a treaty that gives full transparency. So this whole thing about what the Iranians are doing illegally is just a war cry, frankly. It's just somebody coming home and punching their wife in the face and saying, you deserved it, before he even said hello,
I agree. And the Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu's press conference was just abysmal. He took old information that dated back to 2003 and presented it in a very false way, as if it were current, as evidence that you can't trust the Iranians because they were developing nuclear weapons in 2003, which is already acknowledged and known, and that they stopped doing it a couple of years after that. But they still had the capacity. They could have gone into that mode as long as you have these uranium enrichment facilities. You can enrich that uranium to the point where it can be used in a nuclear weapon. So, I mean, there is if your idea is to try and stop that from happening, having inspections are a really important thing. And the fact that Trump wants to just throw that out is part of the whole insanity of the Trump administration. Because if you really don't want them to have nuclear weapons, you might not like aspects of the treaty, but you don't want to throw out the thing that's actually stopping them from getting nuclear weapons, logically.
Yeah.
But if you don't care about that, if you want perpetual war and chaos, which some people do, like I would say John Bolton has given evidence that he favors.
Well, John Bolton is
something
itching
along
to
those
start
lines.
a war. He wants to start a
Right.
war. I mean,
Yes.
on this in IPPNW webpage, in this little brochure, it's so well written. People could review it. This is a very well written article. It's makes an effort to be unbiased. I highly recommend people going to your website. After our last conversation, when you first were there, I really explored your website, and I have to say it's very helpful to the non-professional person who's an activist who
the person
wants
who
to
maintains
understand.
it is. Yeah, John Loretz, my predecessor, continues to maintain it as a volunteer. I'm totally indebted to him, the fact that he's able to do that, and I don't have to, but he's so knowledgeable. He's been working in this issue now for about 40 years.
Well, he's
So
grabbed
he knows
some
what he's
gems.
talking
He
about.
says this,
Yeah.
we recall the words of U.S. President John F. Kennedy referring not to the NPT, but calling in support for the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty in June of 1963. I'm going to quote this so we can hear what he said, because this is unbelievable. No treaty, however much it may be to the advantage of all, however tightly it may be worded, can provide absolute security against the risks of deception and evasion. But it can, if it is sufficiently effective in its enforcement, and if it is sufficiently in the interest of its signers, offer far more security and far fewer risks than an unabated, uncontrolled, unpredictable arms race.
Yeah.
And that is really what we're talking about right now. This is really, we're at a point where we have to take this seriously and we have to speak up, you know.
Well, we are in danger of having a new arms race because every nuclear weapons state is modernizing their arsenal right now.
That's right.
And preparing to have these weapons for decades. You know,
That's right.
This was the horrible trade-off between Obama and the Senate. You know, he early in his administration got the Russians. He and Putin signed an agreement to reduce their nuclear arsenals further. But in order to get the 2/3 majority vote you need to ratify that treaty, he ended up agreeing to modernize our entire nuclear weapons complex, which has been deteriorating, has been like at Hanford, and is basically a cleanup site, a series of cleanup sites around the country. Now they want to spend, originally it was $1 trillion, now they're estimating it would be $1.7 trillion over the next 30 years to just basically redo everything. So in case we want to build more nuclear weapons, we'll have the ability to do it. Which is it's beyond insane we have a stockpile of plutonium at this point. We don't need to produce more plutonium.
Well, I was told the plutonium, you need to produce it because it loses its ability to create nuclear weapons like the spark. So you have to keep building more and more.
Not true. What you have to have more of is tritium to turn a standard nuclear weapon into a hydrogen bomb. And tritium is an unstable form of hydrogen, a radioactive form of hydrogen. And it is the sort of the atmosphere in which a standard old-style Hiroshima and Nagasaki explosion causes a hydrogen implosion. So the phrase "more bang for the buck" dates back to the creation of the hydrogen bomb. That you now create something.
Now, what's the story
much
about
larger
plutonium? I'm very confused because someone that I thought understood this told me that because I don't
They're just
understand
wrong because they do understand that what they heard was that you have to replenish nuclear weapons if you want them to have the same explosive power, and that's true. And right now, a commercial reactor, part of the Tennessee Valley Authority in Tennessee at Watts Bar, is producing the tritium that it then sells to the U.S. Department of Energy that maintains the nuclear weapons arsenal. And that tritium then replaces the old, it has a 14-year half-life. So after 14 years, half of the tritium's gone. And that means that the explosion's going to be less. So they periodically refresh their nuclear weapons with new tritium.
Okay, so then I'm sorry to just go all over the place here, Chuck, but now my mind is having to ask another question. Tritium happens to be leaking into our water supply from several that I know about nuclear facilities, like Indian Point in New York, for example. Why can't they just capture that water and use it for the nuclear industry?
Well, they could. I think it's probably more expensive to do it that way. I mean, this is
but it would stop it from going into the Hudson Bay.
That's true.
That's just outrageous. They're like, oh, well, we have a problem. A little bit of tritium, no big deal. I think that's a big deal. It's been going on for over 2 years. So no.
Well, tritium is a really common pollutant because, once water becomes radioactive, the hydrogen atoms become radioactive and they come into contact with radioactive materials or other things that have been activated, and then water moves. I mean, water goes everywhere, and that's what happens. That's how tritium gets everywhere.
Yeah.
So it can cause health problems for people. Having radioactive hydrogen, having radioactive water in your body, isn't a guarantee that you're going to get a cancer or have some problem, but it increases your odds. So it's
I guess, like Heidi Lambert says, look, since they've been bomb testing, we have everything. Like, we just know about it, right? But then, okay, so back to the treaty. In terms of getting, how close are you? How many people have, you said there's 5 countries that signed?
8. 8 have signed and ratified. And
how
58
close
have
are
signed.
you to getting other ones on? Like, are we on the verge of
quite a few? Well, we're going to have, probably by the end of June, from the estimates, we'll be at around 15. We're going to have another 7. And then we're hoping that causes sort of a tipping point among the friends and allies of the countries that have signed and ratified at that point. And
you'll have
one of the early ones is going to be New Zealand, which is a good one for us because that's still a U.S. military ally. And the U.S. has just pretty much had to, they made us in New Zealand ignore the fact that they don't like nuclear weapons and that they don't want them in their harbors. So it's interesting that they've managed to, they're a good example to the rest of the allies, military allies of the United States, that it is possible to have anti-nuclear weapons policy and also still be a U.S. ally. Because that has been one of the ways they keep people in line is, we're not going to, you can't be our ally anymore if you don't vote with us on this important part of our military strategy. And for particularly some of these countries that are on the border with Russia and former Warsaw Pact countries that are clinging to NATO, I mean, they're some of the most vociferous in favor of nuclear weapons in a weird way. They're in danger, but they feel like they're in danger from sort of a resurgent nationalist Russia, in addition to, and so in the balance, they're more likely to want to have that NATO protection, and NATO protection comes with nuclear weapons. So, we've got, we definitely have once we get I'm starting to feel more confident, and we're working with people in the Caribbean, in Latin America, in Africa, in the Asia Pacific. Those are the places where most of the likely signers are located, in the places where it's not really part of the U.S.'s nuclear alliance, more of the non-aligned types of countries. Also Central Asia, Kazakhstan. And Mongolia,
let's just be clear. All the people that have signed on to it are all the targets of experimentation.
True.
I mean, that's the thing. They're either targets of experimentation or what is considered frivolous war. Oh, well, we'll just go over there and bomb those people. I mean, that's the downside. So what I hear you saying is that the United States our entire strategy is firmly 100% embedded in promoting and maintaining nuclear weapons and nuclear power, period, no matter what.
Currently, and it was true also in the Democratic administration. Obama clearly favored, and he actually gave a speech in Prague early in his administration that he wanted to abolish nuclear weapons. But he, in his policy, he was favoring reducing but not getting rid of them. And he did go along with this so-called compromise that locked in place the United States developing its new capacity for maintaining and increasing the arsenal. So it's part of it's been an essential part of the military-industrial complex, which has an economic stake in the government continuing to follow this policy, and it's the type of corruption that's really influenced the political parties in Congress since we were warned about it by Eisenhower. After World War II, General Eisenhower, quite familiar with the military, he saw while he was president that
that's true.
Hey,
John Goffman talks about it himself, how Congressman Hollingsworth was like, he don't tell us.
Yeah, right. He was not a peacenik by any stretch of the imagination. He was a military guy. But what he saw was, they would try to make military decisions and aggressive ones too. He was not a peacenik, but it wouldn't be sufficient for the industry. The industry would go around what the president wanted and get Congress to approve additional money for stuff that they wanted to have built that the military thought they didn't really need.
They're doing that today. They did that in the last
budget.
It's
happened
they
ever
do
since.
It all the time.
Exactly.
I just watched on C-SPAN a congressman saying, a military man saying, we don't need those tanks. We'd rather you not spend it. Like, literally, we don't need them. They're antiquated. And then the guy said, well, the money's been appropriated and we're going to finish this job up because that's what we do. And that's just the way, so it's insults all around. That's the thing.
Yeah.
There's insults all around. And the hard part is, though, with our government firmly clung to nuclear power and nuclear energy and nuclear bombs, it puts us in an extremely dangerous position as Americans. And we were not offered the choice. It wasn't, do you want to have it? Are you choosing to have this?
Yeah, and most people think that it's there to protect us, and they haven't really been exposed. And it is going to be our job. Once the rest of the world decides that this is an unacceptable weapon, that is going to put pressure on the nuclear weapon states. And, granted, a lot of America doesn't care what the rest of the world thinks of us. In fact, they're contemptuous of it. But there still is a significant portion of the United States that does care, does want to have the United States perceived as a positive force in the world, and will react to somewhat to this new reality that nuclear weapons are a pariah weapon, that threatening to use them is against international law, and having them is against international law, and particularly if we start to lose some of our allies on the issue. So it's going to be really critical to get some of the allied countries to reject nuclear weapons as part of foreign policy. And then at that point, perhaps, if we have the kind of leadership that, we almost put it together in the 80s between the Soviet Union and the United States, but, maybe we can finish the job between the nuclear weapon states where everybody agrees to have enormously intrusive inspections and goes down to zero. And that would be, you can envision it. It's not like something that's going to happen tomorrow, and it's not going to be easy. But
the thing is, what do you do with that stuff? When you tear them apart, think about what that would mean. What do you do with all those components?
Right. Well, we already have that problem now because they've taken apart a number. We had such enormous overkill during the Cold War. Right. That we have all of this stockpile of plutonium, and their original plan, which came out under Al Gore when he was vice president, he was in charge of, what do you do with the excess plutonium? And we signed an agreement with Russia that we would mix it with uranium and burn it in our commercial nuclear power plants. Well, our corrupt DOE process put that plant in Savannah River in South Carolina, and then they hired corrupt construction companies who failed to actually build the plant. And I don't really understand how that happened, but it went on for years and years. They got paid tens of billions of dollars, not tens of billions, billions of dollars. And then the Obama administration pulled the plug on it because what they had built wasn't actually going to work, and the commercial nuclear power industry wasn't interested in buying overpriced fuel. And the other thing is mixed oxide fuel, the plutonium in the fuel, actually harms reactors. It has energy spikes that
that is
put
not
more
an
wear and
accident,
tear on
Chuck.
a reactor.
They knew this. This is not an accident. This is the whole nuclear industry duping us. Okay, you guys want to get rid of it? They just play footsie for a long time and let us pay them billions of dollars, and then they go, oops.
Well, but other countries are doing it. I mean, are using MOX. MOX is being used, mixed oxide fuel is being used in Japan, it's being used in France, it's being used in Great Britain. And and they managed to build facilities that worked and that run it, that produce MOX fuel. So I'm not sure why the United States failed at that. I haven't analyzed it, but I suspect corruption probably had a lot to do with it. And the fact that they would get paid whether it actually worked or not, that's probably the key thing. And
the nuclear industry is incentivized to fail. They get paid bonuses whether they do it right or do it wrong. Meet the deadline is all that matters. And that's the interesting thing about
we're back at square one. You asked about what do you do with this plutonium that could be made into bombs. Arjun Makhijani, who's a physicist who's been an anti-nuclear theorist and somebody that we've relied on for technical information, had an idea years ago in the 90s when this was being discussed that you could take plutonium and put it in the middle of high-level waste canisters that you'd put in a high-level repository as a way to keep it away from people for a really long period of time, because that stuff will remain hot for so long that if somebody wanted to get back and try and retrieve it, that would be a messy, dangerous, and dirty job that would be very difficult. And my thought is that they need to go back to something like that, because we have all this high-level waste. It's got to go somewhere. We might as well stick the plutonium in with it and bury it as deep as we can and try to keep people from getting back at it. I mean, we don't have good answers to anything. We have less bad answers to this horrible situation we've created with the nuclear industry and with nuclear weapons. So, there's one country now that's actually seems to be on the verge of having a functioning high-level repository deep in the ground in granite, and that's Finland. It will be very interesting and important to see how well that works when they start actually putting waste in there.
When do they project that will happen? When do they think that will happen?
I keep hearing it in a few years. It may be one of those type of projects where, in the next 5 years, and then 10 years from now, you hear it will be in the next 5 years. But I think it's supposedly at this point, the last I heard is in the next 5 years, they should start putting waste in there. And it's right next to a nuclear power complex. So it's in a community that agreed to have it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's deep in granite, which is a really good medium in terms of of being able to seal stuff in without it leaking out into the other parts of the environment.
Without it leaching, exactly.
So we'll see if it works. I mean, hope it does.
We hope it does too, because
if it does, I hope it doesn't then make people feel like, oh, well, that's great. That works great. Well, let's go generate a lot more of this stuff.
Yeah, see, nuclear power is awesome. I mean, we only have so much underground that we can bury this stuff in. That's the thing. We're a finite planet,
Yeah, and And also, why do we want to create messy problems that are hard to solve when we can generate our electricity in ways that are much simpler and not as messy? It's like, hello, people, wake up. Don't do that anymore.
I mean, we're basically using 18th, 19th century technology in the 21st century, to be honest, with nuclear energy.
Mostly with the fossil
even the
fuel
nuclear
side
weapons,
of it. Nuclear is 20th century, but that's old. We're in the 21st century now.
But the thing is, the nuclear, the way they generate nuclear power is through 19th century thought with the water processing plants. Yeah. You know what I mean? They haven't even really kept up with their own technology, or they're resisting keeping up with. I mean, imagine if they were using alternative energy forces, the things that they might be able to discover if they really embrace magnetic energy or hydropower.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of interesting things happening. And I think one thing that, that isn't talked about a lot is geothermal energy, and just the natural heat difference between even a few feet underneath the ground versus what's above the ground. And, as time goes on, that I think in terms of new construction, that's going to be an important way that people reduce their energy footprint, their need for heating and cooling, and maybe even for electricity too. So I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of hopeful signs. It's just like, is it fast enough? These ideas were around 40 years ago, and they weren't.
But this is the good thing about you
pushing these other things.
Well, Chuck, you say 15 more nation states are signed on to the treaty, right, and are ratifying them, right? So that's actually a big number, because in sales, they say when you're selling a product, the first 25% takes a really long time. It takes the longest cycle. The second 25% goes faster than the first, usually by a third or 50%. But the third 25% sells immediately. There's something about that 100th monkey process, right?
Yeah.
And then the last 25%, they take a long time, but they eventually get there. And there's a small percentage, 10% or 8%, that will never, ever convert. And that's kind of where we're at with people shifting their brains, that this friendly nuclear atom, the peaceful atom, not so peaceful. I really appreciate you devoting your life's work to this. This is really, I want to thank you personally on behalf of all humanity.
Well, it's probably the most exciting and fun thing I've ever done. So it's certainly not a chore to be doing it. And I encourage others to get active if they can and figure out what groups in their area are working on either nuclear power or nuclear weapons issues, in addition to the climate work, because I know that's been and remains really important.
Well, I still contend that the climate and the nuclear issues are, I think climate and nuclear are so more intertwined than anybody believes. I mean, I genuinely believe that the nuclear test bombing really made an impact on climate change, also on helping to just change the whole ecosystems, destroyed enough. We were bombarded with nuclear bombs for 10 full years.
Well, we definitely are having some health effects related to that. Yeah,
and I think
the environment was made more radioactive. It's measurable.
Exactly.
The atomic age is measurable, and geologically will be easy to find. But if there are any future ecologists or archaeologists, which we hope there will be.
Hey, Chuck, we need to jump in. We've got 10 seconds left. You've been listening to Chuck Johnson, IPPNW.org. Check out the website. Put your courage feet on. Thank you for joining us. Thanks, Chuck.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Great.